For privacy reasons, the names of individuals involved in this case have been changed. Stay tuned. From 1974 to 1991, a brutal killer terrorized Wichita, Kansas. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, and turned each case into a psychological torture, not only for his victims, but also for the community and the police. Not only did this killer kill in cold blood, but he also enjoyed playing cat and mouse with authorities, bragging about his crimes in letters. After nearly 3 decades, he was finally caught, closing one of the most terrifying serial killer cases in American history. What made him stop killing for more than a decade? And what made him so confident that he exposed himself? How sick was the mind behind that mask? Where every unsolved mystery contains secrets that want to be revealed, step into the darkness and explore them with us. Don't hesitate to leave a like as an encouragement for us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to update the most classic cases. Ronald Carter was born on March 9, 1945, in Kansas, and grew up in a seemingly normal family, with no obvious signs that he would become one of America's most brutal killers. His parents were hardworking, and on the surface his family looked like any other typical middle-class family. However, from an early age, Carter showed signs of abnormality that no one noticed or intervened in time. From an early age, Carter showed violent tendencies. He often tortured animals, a typical sign of later serial killers. He not only killed them, but also enjoyed watching them suffer, finding pleasure in controlling their life and death. In addition, he was obsessed with strangulation, an obsession that stemmed from his sick fantasies. He often fantasized about tying someone up, controlling their breathing, and deciding when they would die. As he grew older, Carter seemed more normal to those around him. He enlisted and served in the military for a while, which helped him learn many useful skills for his future crimes, such as how to tie someone up or how to hide his tracks. After leaving the military, he studied criminal justice, a terrifying paradox for a murderer with knowledge of how the police work. This made him an extremely dangerous predator, as he understood the investigative system and knew how to stay hidden. After graduating, Carter worked in security and later became a supervisor, a job that gave him the sense of power he craved. On the surface, he was a model citizen, a gentleman, married with children, active in community activities, and even serving as president of his church council. He created an image of a loving husband, a loving father, a devout believer, and a moral and responsible man. But behind that perfect mask, he was a manipulator and a control freak. Carter's thirst for power did not stop at everyday relationships. He wanted more than that. He wanted complete control over people, both physically and mentally. He began to sneak into other people's homes, not to steal, but to observe, monitor, and plan. He loved the feeling of being able to move freely in someone's private space without them knowing. Each time, he felt more excited, feeling like a god deciding the fate of others. And then, from the fantasies in his head, Carter turned them into reality. He started killing. On the morning of January 15, 1974, one of the most brutal crimes in Wichita, Kansas, took place when the Owen family was targeted by brutal killer Ronald Carter. With careful preparation, he sneaked into their home by cutting the telephone wires to prevent anyone from calling for help. He then entered the house with a gun and took the family, including John Owen, 38, Mary Owen, 33, and their 2 young children, Thomas, 9, and Lisa, 11, hostage. Under the guise of a robber looking for money, Carter pretended to reassure them that he only wanted valuables and would not harm anyone. However, once he had everyone under control, he pulled out ropes and began tying them up one by one. He tightened the ropes around their necks, one by one, starting with John, the father who tried to resist but was completely helpless against the brutal killer. He then moved on to Mary, then the 2 innocent children. Carter carried out his murders slowly and deliberately. He watched his victims struggle, capturing the moment of panic in their eyes as they realized death was approaching. He enjoyed every minute of their mental and physical torture. After killing the entire family, he calmly left the scene, feeling satisfied and excited. After the first massacre, Carter was not afraid, but on the contrary, he felt excited by the absolute power he had when deciding the lives of others. He began to plan the next murders. 3 years after the first attack, Carter continued to attack Linda Howard, 25, a young woman who lived alone. He had been following her for a long time, observing her daily routine, looking for the right time to strike. One evening in March 1977, Carter broke into Linda's house through a window. When the victim discovered his presence, she tried to resist but was immediately overpowered. He tied Linda tightly with rope and brutally tortured her before strangling her to death. After committing the crime, he left the scene and left behind characteristic signs. Complex rope knots and marks on the victim's body, indicating prolonged torture. On April 27, 1985, Carter struck again, this time with Emily Turner, 53, a middle-aged woman who lived alone. He followed her for several weeks before deciding to carry out the attack. That night, Carter broke into Emily's home and strangled her to death in her bedroom. Police found signs of a struggle, indicating that the victim had tried to resist until the last moment. However, like the previous victims, she could not escape the hands of the cold-blooded killer. A year after the Emily Turner case, Carter continued to commit crimes against Sophia Marks, 28 years old. She was a young, single woman living in a quiet residential area. Carter broke into her home at night, tied her up with rope, and carried out his ritual murder, torturing her physically and mentally before strangling her to death. However, this time, he also left a letter, describing in detail the excitement he felt when taking the lives of others. In the letter, he wrote about how he enjoyed the fear in his victims' eyes, how they desperately begged for their lives, but he still coldly ended them. This letter became an important part of the police investigation file, contributing to the portrait of a brutal and haunting serial killer. After each case, Carter became more and more daring. He enjoyed the feeling of playing with the police and the press, constantly sending anonymous letters to mock the authorities, giving hints about his identity, but still not being caught. The hunt lasted for decades, but he remained hidden in society, continuing to live a double life, both a model citizen and a bloodthirsty monster. Carter not only killed people, but he also wanted recognition. He craved attention from the public and the authorities, wanting to become a legendary killer. After each case, he did not flee or completely hide his traces, but instead, he actively contacted the police and the press to brag about his crimes. He gave himself the nickname BTK, an acronym for Bind, Torture, Kill, as a manifesto of his method of committing crimes. His first letter appeared in late 1974 after the Owen family murders. He sent it to a local newspaper, describing in gruesome detail how he had done it. In the letter, Carter not only listed his brutal actions, but also taunted the police, challenging them to catch him. He was so confident that he declared that he would continue to kill, and no one could stop him. Police immediately took the letter seriously, but without fingerprints or any other specific clues, they were unable to track down the person behind it. Over the next several years, Carter continued to send letters and clues to newspapers and investigators. He provided information that only the real killer would know, such as the exact locations of the bodies, detailed descriptions of the crime scenes, and even composed bizarre poems and prose about his victims. For him, murder was not just an act, but a twisted art that he wanted the world to recognize. The Wichita police force worked to investigate hundreds of suspects. They collected evidence from the murders, checked fingerprints, compared DNA samples, and questioned individuals who acted suspiciously. However, Carter was very careful. He left no biological traces at the scene, had no clear motive, and the victims had no direct connection to each other, making it difficult for the police to identify a specific suspect. The investigation dragged on in vain, leaving the whole community in fear. Meanwhile, Carter continued his double life perfectly. During the day, he was a model man in the eyes of his family and society. A responsible husband and father, an ordinary citizen with a stable job. He actively participated in church activities and was respected by everyone. But when night fell, he became a real monster, stalking, torturing, and killing people without mercy. However, in 1991, Carter suddenly disappeared from the crime arena. He no longer committed crimes and did not send any more letters. The police and public opinion were confused by this sudden silence. Was he arrested for another crime? Was he dead or on the run? Or had he simply satisfied his bloodlust and decided to stop? In reality, Carter was just hiding, enjoying the feeling of having outwitted the world. He was so confident that he could not be caught. For the next decade, He lived a normal life, thinking that the BTK nightmare was truly over. Little did he know that his complacency would lead him to make a fatal mistake, leading to his eventual downfall. In 2004, when his first case turned 30 years old, Carter suddenly returned after more than a decade of hiding. It seemed that normal life had failed him. Or perhaps he felt that the lack of mention of BTK had made him gradually forgetful. For someone as obsessed with recognition as Carter, that was unacceptable. He decided to awaken the horror once more. In March 2004, Carter sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle in which he identified himself as BTK and provided details about old cases that only the real killer would know. The letter contained a copy of evidence from the 1986 murder scene of Sophia Marks, along with a statement threatening more killings. This shocked Wichita. BTK had never been caught, and now he had reappeared. Throughout the year, Carter continued to send out various packages, including poems, riddles, and even pranks to mock the police. He hid these packages in public places like parks or in mailboxes. One time, he sent a box containing a doll tied up with rope, simulating how he had killed his victim. However, this overconfidence led to his fatal mistake. In February 2005, Carter continued to show off. He sent a floppy disk to Key SAS TV with some other documents. He thought that digital technology would help him hide his identity better than writing letters. However, he did not know that even digital files can retain traces of the last editor. Forensic experts immediately examined the floppy disk and discovered something surprising. In the metadata, hidden data of the file, there was a line stating the username Carter and a reference to Christ Lutheran Church. This meant that the disk had been modified from a computer belonging to the church, where Carter was the chairman of the board. The police could not believe their luck. After decades of futilely searching for BTK, he had now provided the most important clue. They immediately identified Carter and began to closely monitor him. On February 25, 2005, the police arrested Carter right in front of his house. He was completely caught off guard and had no time to escape or destroy evidence. When brought into the interrogation room, Carter quickly confessed without showing any remorse. On the contrary, he enthusiastically recounted every detail of the murders in meticulous and gruesome detail. He explained that he had meticulously planned each case, from stalking his victims, breaking in, tying them up, torturing them, and finally killing them. He described the thrill of seeing his victims struggle before they died and spoke of the pleasure of controlling other people's lives. Carter's confession shocked the nation. He was not only a serial killer, but also a control freak and a narcissist, believing that he could fool the police forever. But in the end, it was his arrogance and desire for recognition that led to the downfall of a criminal empire that had lasted for more than 30 years. In June 2005, Carter was formally charged with 10 murders spanning from 1974 to 1991. Although police suspected that he may have more undiscovered victims, there was not enough evidence to convict him. Because the crimes occurred before Kansas reinstated the death penalty in 1994, Carter could not be sentenced to death but could only be sentenced to life in prison. Carter's trial took place in August 2005. When he stood before the court, he showed no remorse or regret. Instead of remaining silent or pleading guilty, he calmly described each murder in terrifying detail. He recounted how he stalked his victims, broke into their homes, tied them up, and carried out the crimes step by step as if he were recounting a routine job. Many of the victims' relatives were present at the trial, listening in pain and anger. As Carter described the killings in a matter-of-fact tone, some family members burst into tears, and others shook with anger. Some were so upset that they had to leave the courtroom mid-sentence. When the sentencing came, the judge called Carter a monster without a soul and sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. That meant he would never be released. After his conviction, Carter was sent to El Dorado State Prison in Kansas, where he was kept in a maximum security prison. He was isolated from other inmates, closely monitored, and had little interaction with the outside world. In prison, however, Carter continued to maintain his old personality traits. He kept tight control over everything he could, from the arrangement of his cell furniture to keeping a diary about his daily life. He still tried to maintain his presence by sending letters to journalists, crime researchers, and sometimes even morbid fans who were obsessed with serial killers. However, his efforts to maintain his reputation were tightly controlled by the authorities. Every letter he sent out was carefully screened, and any attempt to cash in on his murderous reputation was banned. To this day, Carter remains in prison with no prospect of release. His crimes have left a deep scar on the history of Wichita, Kansas, and the United States. Locals still remember the years they lived in fear while BTK was free. His story is still told as a lesson in the dangers of serial killers who can hide in the midst of society behind the guise of an ordinary citizen. Even though he was captured and imprisoned for many years, the name Carter still makes people shudder every time it is mentioned. But most importantly, his series of crimes has ended forever, and he will never have the opportunity to cause more pain to anyone. The BTK killer instilled fear not only through his brutal murders, but also through the way he hid himself perfectly under the guise of a model citizen. For more than 30 years, he lived in the community, participated in social activities, had a wife and children, went to work, and went to church like everyone else. He was not a loner, eccentric, or suspicious looking. On the contrary, he was a friendly neighbor, a devoted father, and a respected church council president. This is what made him one of the most feared killers in history. The horror he caused was not only in his brutal murders, but also in the fact that, for many years, no one suspected him. Neighbors still greeted him every day, friends still sat and chatted with him, and his wife and children still trusted him, while he continued to plan attacks on the next victims. After his arrest, Carter admitted that he enjoyed the feeling of control, not only over his victims but also over the community and the police. He enjoyed the feeling of being able to walk freely among people who had no idea that he was the monster they were hunting. This raises a terrifying question. How many more killers like Carter are out there, hiding their true nature under the guise of a normal person? The reality is that serial killers like Carter are not always suspicious. Many of them have stable jobs and families, and are even respected by their communities. Other notorious killers like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer all had normal social lives before they were discovered. This makes identifying and catching people like Carter much more difficult. Today, thanks to advances in forensic science and surveillance technology, the ability to detect serial killers has improved significantly. However, many cases remain unsolved, and many perpetrators may still be at large, continuing to lead double lives without anyone knowing. Carter's case is a terrifying reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows, and sometimes they live right among us, in the light of day, without anyone noticing. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this story and want to dive deeper into more intriguing mysteries, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.